Hello, listeners. Today we are releasing another episode from our new series entitled The Gene Simmons of Data Protection, the KISS Method, brought to you by none other than Protegrity. Protegrity is AI-powered data security for data consumption, offering fine-grained data protection solutions so you can enable your data security, compliance, sharing, and analytics. In this episode, we talk with Anthony Camerano, CTO and VP of Engineering at Protegrity, as he breaks down and simplifies GenAI for companies struggling in the new frontier. There's a flood of unstructured data pouring into workflows thanks to GenAI, and traditional security methods aren't prepared to cover this expanded attack surface. The good news is that companies already have what they need to fix this, and it's a simple mindset shift. Well, Anthony, thank you for being on the show today. Thank you for being on Code Story.
Thank you, Noah. It's great to be here and excited about our topic today.
Absolutely. Before we dive into that topic, which we're going to jump into, all things GenAI-security, tell me and my audience a little bit about you.
Generally been in technology for over 25 years now. The last probably 15 to 17 years in cybersecurity, and probably the last almost 10 years now in the data and AI space. So I've been in and around it quite a lot, and I do enjoy it both professionally and personally. So I also enjoy applying some of the theory and AI in sports, so in fantasy sports, and I've done some of my own sports statistic and prediction models, and I enjoy applying that there as well. And then I'm also a big hiker and backpacker. Anytime I get an opportunity to put a backpack on and spend a few nights under the stars, I would always take advantage of that.
Awesome. Well, that's great. I appreciate that little bit about you. Let's dive into the meat of it. So, we're exploring GenAI-security here. We're looking to have you break down and simplify this for us. So just kicking it right off, what are some of the most common misconceptions or trends about GenAI and GenAI being generative AI as it relates to data protection, privacy, and what organizations face today?
So there's a ton of misconceptions, but in the context of really in the data security and privacy space, and it often comes down to a theme of, I don't need to do anything, right? And what I have today and what I do today can and will cover what is coming at me in the context here of GenAI. That manifests itself in different ways. That can be in the privacy or data protection space. I don't need to do anything special. And I think when you start to break down what's happening in GenAI and the volume of information, both in training time, in inference time, when we talk about even in retrieval augmented generation models and RAG models, and we're talking now about agents and agent to agent, this really is a misconception. Understanding that data is really moving, the controls that surround it in a traditional analog sense, and I'm going to say analog because it really does come back to for me, the analog to digital that's the kind of gap I think that we're starting to see. And so if we retain this idea that all of my existing controls, which are generally in the analog space, are going to cover us in the digital space, I think that's a significant misconception and one that we do see. I think another one is around just LLMs and how they came about. There was all this publicity of all of this public data mining and this notion that it's all public data. And so I don't have to be concerned with what it was trained on or potentially what it might leak as a result. We have seen, and I think we can all agree, that what is available on the public internet does include private or sensitive information, in which case certainly a corporation, a company, needs to be aware of and needs to account for. I think the idea that I currently meet my existing compliance or my GDPR means that I'm going to be okay as I adopt GenAI. And I think what we're actually seeing is a real adaptation and additional privacy and compliance regulation coming at us, and really understanding how that's evolving, understanding that existing capabilities, solutions, compliance, controls, all of what you have today is not necessarily going to serve you in the future. And I'll say one last misconception is these models don't actually store sensitive data, and so they don't have the capability to generate sensitive data. What we've seen in terms of different attack vectors, different ways in which these models start to get used and connected to APIs and data systems, I think that's a misconception to believe that there isn't some way to either through memorization at training of sensitive data or through exfiltration at inference of sensitive data. I think all of those misconceptions start to show themselves as we look at the body of evidence that's growing.
Super interesting. Okay. I'm glad you pointed out that there's not a storage of this, private data by these LLMs. But, and in general, right, these misconceptions are challenges for these businesses. But what are the primary business challenges that are facing the adoption of GenAI today?
If we go back to how I talked about some of the misconceptions, so thinking about this massive corpus of data that is being used both and specifically in training, but also in inference, first and foremost, and actually this was the first to hit the industry, was this idea of legal or intellectual property infringement. And so understanding if I used an LLM to produce something new or to create an idea, what legality of maybe copyright, legal, or intellectual property infringement do I have? That's a new business challenge to ask and to face. I think that was probably the first one that hit. At the time, there was a lot of case law starting to fill the courts. There's been some decisions here and there. I'd say we've seen model providers start to do indemnification or certain services do indemnification. And so this is a little bit further on the resolution side, but still indeterminate relative to different case law that might come out of it. But certainly legal and IP infringement is one. When we think about using these models, and this is going back to the analog to digital space, the jump goes from what we're traditionally used to in terms of deterministic decision-making and approaches to a much more probabilistic decision-making and approach. And certainly in cybersecurity, that's a big jump because in cyber, everything's got to be deterministic. But at the business level as well, there's a lot of AI today that operates at the deterministic level, and that is moving to a probabilistic. So understanding how, from a probability standpoint, a model can start to make things up or can do things in a way that you did not intend. So things like hallucination and safety risks now become a very real business challenge as you look at how and where you're going to adopt GenAI. And then again, and this is going to be a common theme, the data. So all of this is driven by data, massive amounts of data. Again, both at training, fine tuning, inference in RAG, retrieval augmented generation, now in different model context protocols and MCP and agent to agent. So we're connecting tools, we're connecting web search. We were just introducing so much data, and the opportunity for data leakage, for intellectual property to leak is present, that it is a business challenge here. When we think about using and adopting this technology, it is absolutely, front of mind or needs to be front of mind, how that business challenge is either going to be mitigated or overcome.
Okay, so that's really interesting. And I think I could cherry pick, a handful of things that pop up in my mind when I think of this next question from what you just said. How do modern GenAI systems create these data security vulnerabilities? And what are the, maybe explicit potential risks there?
So I'd say there's really three topics for what the new adoption of this technology introduces in terms of vulnerability and risk. Number one, we look at the user base, right? Your user persona, your identity, who's accessing what. When we look at what we know today and consider that the analog space, we have pretty well-defined personas. But what we're seeing is just an absolute explosion relative to direct access to data, whether that's embedded in a model itself or it's retrieved in an inference augmentation or it's connected via an agent, tool, or query, the capability for an unknown corpus of identities, users, machines, agents, there's just an absolute explosion of a broader set of these user interactions. And when we think about security vulnerability and potential risk, we can no longer think in this sort of analog space. We have to start thinking about this indeterminate user space. Additionally, we look at I call it the dynamism of data, how data is flowing and all the different systems and touch points that data will now flow through. So again, if you think back to traditional or analog, data may sit in maybe a transactional system. Then we had this big data and analytics. And so maybe it's sent to a warehouse. And generally it lived in one or two environments. There was a set of personas to it. Now we're seeing it pushed into training. We're seeing it pushed into fine-tuning. We're seeing it pushed into inference retrieval. We're seeing it pushed into agent tool calling and querying. And so we're seeing just an absolute explosion in the dynamism of where this data actually can live and be presented. It is not just sitting in the data store or the data warehouse anymore. It is really living and breathing outside in many different areas, creating all kinds of new attack surface, security vulnerabilities, and risks. One of the key aspects for this dynamism of data is the fact that we are talking about large language models for the most part when we talk about GenAI. And a lot of this in the L for language is built on unstructured data. And when you look at the governance within corporates, within enterprise, the governance structure around unstructured data is very immature, very loosely defined. We don't necessarily have these robust data catalogs and data owners and data schemas and all of the governance that we wrap around structured data. But now when we talk about conversation and language and unstructured data, we have just an absolute wild west of unstructured data. So really it comes down to that massive set of user interactions, the dynamism of data, and the fact that it is, generally speaking, an untapped governance set of data when it comes to the unstructured data space.
Interesting. I'm curious, as we move forward with GenAI and implementing GenAI, what is crucial in these implementations of GenAI security solutions, and how can it accelerate AI adoption? And there's a few things that I'm kind of putting together from your answers to the first few questions, which is creating the narrative in my head, but I'm really curious what you're going to say.
Yeah. Again, I think about things in threes probably, but I think about this in three ways. And so the first is you really need to have some kind of discovery mechanism. So again, if we think about data is very dynamic now, it's living outside of its traditional ecosystem. It's very unstructured. You may not have governance on it. There is this level of data discovery, sensitive data discovery. So identifying sensitive data, being able to classify it in a dynamic way is going to be extremely important, as even when new data is generated by GenAI, data is being retrieved outside of the different controls in which it may have originally existed or lived, shared in other ways relative to prompts and responses. Being able to make real-time decisions about what that sensitive data is going to be absolutely critical. Second is privacy. Certainly from a security perspective, I think traditionally cybersecurity, you would say, oh, privacy is not security, and oh, that's something different. But with GenAI, we're seeing this blending of risk into the cybersecurity space as it relates to privacy as well. We see this manifested in multiple areas. So we could talk about privacy in your training data. So not wanting your models to memorize your customer data in a way. So that's a form of privacy plus security. In your fine tuning, so if you're not training models yourself, but maybe you're fine tuning them, again, the same sort of privacy lens over that data. And even in your inference, in retrieval, understanding what kind of privacy vulnerability or risk you need to think about. So thinking about different privacy properties, whether it's just basic minimization, different impact and risk, whether it's in training or whether it's in inference, I think that's going to be an absolute crucial accelerant to adoption. Finally, protection. And this comes down to really taking in my opinion, a data-centric view of protection and not necessarily relying on your existing data stores or at-rest sort of containers of where your data exists today to drive your protection. Authorization should be an on by default mechanism, right? And what I mean by that is if you take a data-centric view to protection, then your data is always protected. And the only time it should ever not be protected is at the authorization layer. And if you look at our traditional controls, it's the exact opposite. We start with clear, unprotected data, and then we try to layer controls on top of it in order to authorize the access to it. So because of this large user interaction space and the dynamism of where it's going to be shared, we need to take that data-centric approach when it comes to the protection side and really try to protect it as close to and as originating to where that data first lives and keep it protected for as long as we can throughout the cycle until and unless key areas where sensitive data needs to be consumed, and then you use an authorization layer to do it there.
Excellent. Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks then. So can you provide an example maybe of how attackers are targeting data during its use and the importance of securing it, right? We're trying to protect around the data, and people are getting smarter in how they're attacking, so we need to secure the data. So tell me about some of the examples where people or attackers, bad actors have been doing this.
One thing I will say is, and I've seen this in the last X years, the last 10 years that I've been involved in this space, it is constantly evolving. Not only as the technology evolves, the attack surface evolves, the vulnerabilities and attack methods evolve, but it's an iterative, it's like a programming paradigm, right? So you make one step forward and the next person takes that advantage or that understanding and makes another step forward and continues to build. While we see that in the capabilities of what we get out of GenAI, we're also seeing that out of the capabilities of the attacker as well. And so this is a constantly evolving field. Just to provide what are some of the current attack vectors out there, or the more common, well-known attack vectors out there. First and foremost, I'd say is, and this has been around for some time, is memorization or model inversion, right? So ultimately, in some way, your model that you've trained has memorized, some of the sensitivity or the intellectual property or the privacy of constituents that might have been in the data set in which you trained on. And because of that, you can now extract sensitive information or extract secrets that have been memorized out of these models. And we saw this early in the deep neural network days, and we still continue to see this now in GenAI and LLM. Data poisoning is another method of attack. And again, this sort of came through the lineage of AI as well. And we used to see this in the vision, self-learning cars. Oh, I can put something on the stop sign and make the car do something crazy, right? So I can poison the data in ways in which when you use it to train a model, I'm somehow maybe injecting something that you're not aware of, or I'm giving myself a backdoor so that when you see something at inference, you're going to react in a way that I can predict. I think the heightened sensitivity to this is all of the public data, the untrusted data that's being used to train these models. When you're using a model, you are trusting the data with which it was trained on, the company in which they did that training. And so I think GenAI has expanded this data poisoning attack much further than what we traditionally have seen. Then we have, in GenAI, we're all now accustomed to this thing called the prompt. It reminds me many years ago of when websites were connected to databases and we had this SQL injection attack. Now we have prompt injection attack. Ultimately, what they're trying to do is create a prompt that somehow fools or evades the model, either its safeguards that it may have built in place or the lack of, to get it to reveal something sensitive or unauthorized that it wouldn't otherwise reveal. This is also sometimes referred to as a jailbreak attack, whether it's through the prompt or not, could be debated. A jailbreak attack is looking to do something very similar. It's trying to evade sort of the safety and guardrails that are built in to get it to leak something unauthorized, whether it's sensitive data or intellectual property. The one thing I'll say about GenAI relative to both data poisoning and these sort of prompt and jailbreak attacks, it's not just about the data that's being used for training. As we start to see model context protocol, so as we start to see agents and agentic workflows and applications, and these models connected to tools and APIs, and Google just came out with the agent to agent, the A2A, I can embed something untrusted at the other end of a tool in which your agent or application or model otherwise trusts and perform what essentially would be a jailbreak or an injection or a poisoning, because it's the consumption of this untrusted aspect in which I can manipulate the system and do things. So the more we get the advancement of all of the different interaction models and applications that we're seeing, the bigger the surface of some of these attack vectors. And that's why I say it's a dynamic that's changing. A month ago, we didn't have A2. A couple months ago, we didn't have MCP. And so we're creating more attack surface as we go. Just to go back to the importance of securing your data in use relative to many of these and all of the concerns that we had talked about, for what I call a data-centric approach, it just makes so much sense when you think about there are very private and very sensitive components of information. Oftentimes, the identity or revealing of that information is not necessarily important to the overall interaction, and it's only important in very specific circumstances where you authorize an individual, set of individuals or system to reveal that information. And it doesn't make sense to me that we take the analog, the old approach, to keep that sensitive data in the clear, have all of these risks surrounding it, and try to, one by one, create tools and processes to mitigate those risks. When in fact, if we take that data-centric view and we protect it from the source, so it moves through our MCP and A2A tool calling as a protected entity. It goes from source in a retrieval query to model shared in a protected form. It's even processed in an LLM and generated back to a user in a protected form. The longer and the more we can keep that data in use in a protected form, the better and more capable we are of whether it's the risks and vulnerabilities I'm identifying today or the risks and vulnerabilities we're going to identify in 3 to 6 months. You're taking a much better posture around your data security and privacy because you automatically inherit 80 to 90% mitigation of the vulnerabilities that we're talking about. Whereas leaving it in the clear and trying to rely on all kinds of disconnected or even interconnected control layer systems to try to keep control and maintain control, I think that's the fool's errand in my mind.
Makes total sense. Okay, what are some of the best practices for robust data governance? And again, being an engineer, being in this space, I could probably magnetically attach a few things to what you're saying. But I'm curious about examples of those best practices and how can organizations stay ahead, right? I mean, you pointed out in your last point, we're rapidly evolving in this landscape. It's moving really fast. So how do they stay ahead?
So I'm probably going to be a little bit of a broken record, but I think it's important because in order to stay ahead, I think you do have to accept that old controls will not work, that data is becoming much more dynamic, and that it really will require a more data-centric approach. Those aspects are the guiding principle to what I think is how organizations can stay ahead. So how do we manifest that a little bit in reality here? So number one, I think, is you've got to have some level of auditing and monitoring capability in order to have visibility around what's happening, what kind of conversation is, what's being exposed to a model, what is the model generating, what questions are being asked, generally being able to understand the data flow and the data movement. And once you have that view, then you can start to do things that are a more data-centric approach, and especially in the unstructured data space. So this is where we look at, can I understand what kind of sensitive data might exist in here? Is something being injected at the prompt? Is something being retrieved at the inference? What kind of sensitive data is actually being interacted with here, providing the classification, and then applying guardrails, different content and safety guardrails. So understanding if maybe I'm providing some kind of toxic output, or perhaps I'm not providing a truthful response. So hallucinations could be even relevant to the data that's being retrieved as part of a RAG retrieval pipeline. But so understanding the sort of content moderation and safety around what your system, what your model is doing. And then finally, that last thing we talked about, which is the malicious side of my prompt. So am I being exposed to some kind of injection, vulnerability, unauthorized manipulation, and understanding then at the input level whether or not something is being malicious to me or is benign. So I think going from that sort of visibility, data-centric, data leakage, data sensitivity and privacy, then to the moderation and safety, and then to that security and vulnerability. This isn't new. If you're in the cybersecurity field, a lot of the sort of bucket grouping, and in fact, NIST, which is a common framework, is a very good one to use in terms of modeling your AI risks as well. OWASP, OWASP, also includes a good framework, and leveraging, I think, even the frameworks that you're used to, most of them have introduced and have done a good job at bucketing and giving you the kind of guidelines to start to think about this effectively.
Excellent. I'm glad you mentioned both of those at the end, especially the OWASP. Well, Anthony, this just makes too much sense. And every time I speak with a team member from Protegrity, I just am more and more understanding of how keeping a data-centric, simple approach to security just is going to work. All of the things, the traditional ways, like you mentioned, are not going to work anymore. They're being, penetrated. Bad actors are getting smarter. They're getting around any of the defenses that we've put up before. No doubt there's a flood of unstructured data with GenAI coming into the world, but businesses can keep it simple and have a data-centric security approach that can simplify their journey. So I really appreciate you walking us through all that and educating us on this topic today. Thanks for being on the show, Anthony.
You got it. Thanks for having me, Noah.
Great convo with Anthony. No doubt there is a flood of unstructured data coming into these GenAI workflows, but businesses can keep it simple and have a data-centric security approach that can simplify the journey to GenAI native security. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about Protegrity, go to protegrity.com. That's PROTEGRITY.com. And thanks again for listening.